Victoria Williams ripped the check in half in front of an elderly woman leaning on a cane. Not folded it, not set it aside. Ripped it. Once, then twice, until the pieces were too small to matter, and let them drop to the marble floor of the Ellsworth branch of Holstead National Bank like they were nothing more than a losing raffle ticket. "I know exactly who you are," she said, loud enough for the entire lobby to hear. "And I know for a fact you don't have $5 million. You could barely make rent." The man standing across the counter from her didn't raise his voice. He reached out instead to steady his mother, whose hand had tightened on her cane the moment the check tore. He looked at the woman behind the counter, a woman he had once shared a bed with, a mortgage with, 6 years of a life with, and said, calmly, like he was reading her a weather report, "You just made the most expensive mistake of your career, Victoria." Security was already stepping forward. And that's the exact moment the branch's regional manager walked through the front doors, saw torn paper scattered across his lobby floor, and went pale. "Mr. Walker," he said. And then he said something Victoria Williams never expected to hear, directed at the man she'd left 12 years earlier for not having a future. He called him sir. Before we get into how this ends, if stories like this one hit home for you, stories about the people we underestimate, sometimes for reasons that go a lot deeper than money, go ahead and hit subscribe, because you won't want to miss the next one. Now let's go back. Let's go back to where this really started, because to understand why that torn check mattered so much, you need to understand the two people standing on either side of that counter, and the 12 years that had passed since they'd last stood this close to each other. Alex Bush had learned a long time ago that the world made up its mind about a man before he ever opened his mouth. He'd learned it first, and most painfully, from the woman who married him. He was 44 years old now, and for the last 3 years he had been the sole caretaker of his mother, Margaret, in the same small house on the edge of Maple Hollow where he'd grown up. Margaret had raised him alone after his father passed when Alex was 9, cleaning houses during the day, taking in sewing work at night, making sure her son never once went without something he needed, even when it meant she went without something she wanted. Alex never forgot that. It was the entire reason he was standing in a bank lobby with a $5 million check on a Tuesday afternoon. 12 years earlier, Alex had been married to a woman named Victoria. They'd met in their 20s, when Alex was still sleeping on a futon in a rented office above a dry cleaner, trying to turn $40,000 of savings and a stubborn idea into something that could support a family. Victoria had liked the idea of him at first, the ambition, the late nights, the way he talked about the company he was building like it was already real. But 3 years into the marriage, with the mortgage on their small house falling behind and the company still years from turning a profit, something in her had changed. "You're 32 years old, and you still believe in this," she told him one night, not as a compliment. "I need someone who can actually take care of a family, Alex. Not someone who's going to make me wait for a future that might never come." She left 3 years later for a man named Richard Ashworth, an insurance executive with a steady salary and a house twice the size of the one she and Alex had struggled to keep. She took her name back to her maiden name for a while, then took his, Victoria Williams, after the divorce. Then Victoria Ashworth once she remarried Richard. Alex didn't fight the divorce. He didn't fight much of anything in those years except the business itself, which is precisely where all his fight went. He never told anyone in Maple Hollow how close he'd come to losing everything in the 2 years that followed. He moved back in with his mother for a stretch, worked from her kitchen table, ate whatever she put in front of him without complaint, and kept building. And then, the way it sometimes does for people who refuse to stop, it worked. An early stake in a technology company most people had never heard of, until, quite suddenly, everyone had. Alex never told Victoria any of it. There was no reason to. They hadn't spoken in years. He'd heard, vaguely and secondhand, through the kind of small-town gossip that travels whether you want it to or not, that she and Richard had eventually split as well, and that she'd gone into bank management somewhere in the region. But gossip like that is rarely specific, and Alex had never had a reason to ask which branch, or care. He hadn't thought much about it. He'd built a life that had nothing to do with her. A firm, a career, a quiet home with his mother in it, a version of success he measured entirely by whether the people who depended on him were taken care of. He still drove the same sedan he'd owned since before the divorce. He still wore the same worn canvas jacket, soft and gray at the elbows now. The one Victoria had once told him made him look like he couldn't afford better, which, at the time, had been true. He kept it anyway, not out of spite, just because it was his, and because he had never seen the point of proving anything to anyone through a coat. That morning, a check for $5 million had cleared into his account, the proceeds of the early stake he'd sold. He already knew exactly what it was for. Half of it would cover his mother's medical bills, the surgery she needed, and had been quietly putting off for a year because she didn't want to be a burden on him, not realizing he'd have paid any amount without a second thought. The other half was meant to seed something he'd been planning for months, a fund for foster children. The kind of support system that hadn't existed for his mother when she was raising him alone, and that he wanted to exist now for kids who had even less than they'd had. He brought his mother along that afternoon because the bank was on the way to her cardiologist appointment, and because she'd insisted on coming inside instead of waiting in the car. "I want to see it," she told him. "I want to see you finally do this." Neither of them expected the stop to take more than 10 minutes. They walked into the Ellsworth branch of Holstead National Bank not long before closing time. Alex had banked there for over a decade, long before Walker Capital Group had a name that meant anything to anyone. He knew the layout, knew where his mother could sit comfortably while he handled the paperwork. What he didn't know, what he had absolutely no way of knowing until he saw the small brass nameplate on the manager's desk, was that Victoria had transferred to this exact branch 4 months earlier. It wasn't a place their old paths had ever had reason to cross before. This was still, as far as Alex understood it, simply his branch, the one he'd used for over a decade, long before he'd ever had anything worth noticing in it. He saw the name before she saw him. Victoria Williams. She'd gone back to her maiden name after the split from Richard, apparently for a moment, standing near the entrance with his mother's handlight on his arm. Alex considered simply coming back another day. It would have been easy. There was no reason to make this harder than it needed to be. But his mother needed the surgery scheduled, and the check needed to clear, and Alex Walker had never been a man who rearranged his life around avoiding discomfort. So he walked forward. Victoria looked up when they approached the counter, and Alex watched the recognition land on her face in real time. The slight widening of her eyes, the flicker of something unreadable, gone almost as fast as it appeared, replaced by a composure that was almost impressive in how quickly she assembled it. "Alex," she said, and there was nothing warm in it. "It's been a while." "Victoria," he kept his voice even. "I didn't know you worked here." "4 months," she said, her eyes moving over him the way they used to when she was deciding whether something he'd said was worth taking seriously. Jacket, then his mother's cane, then the car parked outside that she could see through the front window. Something in her expression settled into a conclusion Alex recognized from 12 years earlier, the same look she used to give him across their kitchen table when the bills came due. "What can I do for you?" Margaret, standing beside her son, offered a small, polite nod. "Hello, Victoria." Victoria's eyes flicked to her, and for just a moment, something almost like discomfort crossed her face. But it didn't stay long. "Margaret," she said, and then to Alex, "What is it you need?" "I'd like to deposit a check," Alex said, and placed it on the counter. Victoria glanced down. The number on it stopped her mid-motion. She looked up at him slowly. "Is this a joke?" "It's not a joke. Alex." She said his name the way you'd say it to a child who just told an obvious lie. "I was married to you for 6 years. I know exactly what your finances look like. I know you couldn't keep up with a mortgage on a house half the size of the one I live in now. And you're telling me you want to deposit a check for $5 million. "I'm telling you, I have a check for $5 million, Alex said, still calm. "And I'd like it deposited into the account I've held here for over a decade." A young teller nearby, whose name tag read Rachel Simmons, had already reached for the check to begin the standard verification process, a routine she'd performed 100 times without incident. Victoria stopped her with a hand raised, not even looking at her. "I've got this one," she said. Rachel hesitated, glanced between the two of them, sensing something in the air that had nothing to do with banking procedure, and stepped back. By now, several customers nearby had noticed the tension building at the counter, not shouting yet, but something colder and more pointed. The kind of tension that draws attention precisely because it doesn't look like a typical dispute. A few pulled out their phones. Victoria leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping just enough to feel more cutting than if she'd shouted it. "You couldn't hold down a mortgage payment, Alex. You expect me to believe some tech company made you a millionaire 5 times over? And you brought your mother in here to help sell it?" Margaret's grip on her cane tightened. "Victoria," she said quietly, "that's not fair, and you know it. With respect, Margaret, I don't think you're in a position to lecture me about what's fair," Victoria said, and something in her tone made even the customers nearby go still. "You two always did have a way of believing your own story." Alex's jaw tightened, the first visible sign of strain he'd shown since walking in. It wasn't the accusation against him that did it. It was watching Victoria speak to his mother that way, the same woman who had taken in sewing work until her fingers bled to keep a roof over Alex's head, standing in a bank lobby being condescended to by the woman who had once decided that same house wasn't good enough for her. "I'll offer to let you call the issuing bank directly," Alex said, keeping his voice level with visible effort now. "It'll take 5 minutes to confirm every detail." "I don't need to call anyone," Victoria said. "I know you, Alex. I was married to you for 6 years. I know exactly what you're capable of, and exactly what you're not. I think you're either lying or someone's given you a fraudulent check, and either way, I'm not processing it without proof that actually holds up." "Then let me speak with someone else," Alex said. "There isn't anyone else right now. I'm the branch manager." Something in her voice had shifted into a register Alex hadn't heard from her before. Not quite anger, something closer to satisfaction. Like she'd been waiting 12 years for a moment exactly like this one, a moment where the story she'd told herself about leaving him could finally be proven right in front of witnesses. "You know what this looks like, don't you? A man who couldn't provide for his own wife, walking in here 12 years later with a fantasy check and his elderly mother as a prop to make it convincing." Margaret's face went pale. Alex's hand found his mother's shoulder, steadying her, and something in his expression finally cracked through the calm he'd been holding onto since he walked in. "That's enough," he said, quiet, but with an edge that hadn't been there before. "You can question the check. You do not get to question my mother." "I'll question whatever I want in my own branch," Victoria snapped, and picked the check up off the counter. She held it for a moment, looking directly at him, 12 years of something unresolved sitting behind her eyes. "People like you," she said, "don't walk in here with $5 million. And then she tore it in half, and then in half again, letting the pieces fall to the floor at his feet, in full view of his mother. The lobby went silent. Margaret reached instinctively toward the torn pieces, her cane wobbling slightly as she bent. Alex caught her elbow gently, steadying her, unwilling to let his mother kneel on a bank floor over what someone had just used to humiliate them both. He looked at Victoria. His voice, when it came, was quiet enough that people had to lean in to hear it, which somehow made it land harder than shouting ever could have. "You just made the most expensive mistake of your career, Victoria." Victoria's hands were shaking slightly, but her expression hadn't softened. She reached for the phone. "I'm calling the police," she said. "I want this documented. Fraudulent instrument, and I want you removed from the premises." A security guard near the entrance, a young man named Dean Coleman, straightened at the sound of her voice, uncertain, watching the scene with the particular stillness of someone who has seen nothing to justify what he's about to be asked to do. "Dean," Victoria said, phone still to her ear. "Escort him out." Dean hesitated. He'd watched the entire exchange from his post, had heard no threats, seen no aggression, nothing but a man asking, repeatedly and calmly, for his check to be verified. But a direct order from his manager, delivered in front of a lobby full of witnesses, left him very little room to argue. Margaret looked up at her son, her eyes wet, her hand trembling slightly on her cane. Alex tightened his hand around his mother's arm. And that's when the front doors opened, and Gerald Ashford, regional manager for Holstead National, and the man who had personally opened Alex's very first business account 15 years earlier, stepped inside and saw torn paper scattered across the floor of his lobby. "Mr. Walker," he said, and his face went pale in a way that told everyone in the room, instantly, that something had just gone very wrong. Gerald had been a junior loan officer at the Ellsworth branch 15 years earlier, the day a young Alex Walker walked in with a modest business account and a plan for a firm that at the time existed mostly on paper. Gerald had sat with him for the better part of an hour that first day and had come away with the quiet, specific sense that he was talking to someone who was going to build something real. He'd helped set up that account personally, and over the years that followed, through Alex's divorce, through the lean years nobody outside a small circle knew about, through the eventual success that Alex never once let change how he carried himself, Gerald had remained one of the very few people who genuinely understood who Alex Walker was. Gerald had been at a regional conference for the past several days and had swung by the Ellsworth branch on his way home to sign off on a routine audit. He'd almost skipped it. Instead, he'd walked in on his branch manager tearing apart a check belonging to one of the bank's most significant clients in front of the man's elderly mother, while a security guard hesitated near the door. "Mr. Walker," Gerald said again, crossing the lobby quickly, his eyes moving from Alex to Margaret to the torn paper scattered across the marble. "Sir, I am so sorry. Whatever just happened here does not reflect this institution, and I need you to know that." Victoria turned at the sound of her boss's voice, phone still in hand, confusion beginning to cloud her composure. "Gerald, sir, this man walked in claiming he had a $5 million check, and given his financial history, I had every reason to." "Do you know who this is?" Gerald asked, and something in his voice cut through the lobby, flat and hard. "I know exactly who he is," Victoria said. "He's my ex-husband." Gerald blinked, momentarily thrown, before recovering. "Then you, of all people, should know that whatever you thought his finances looked like 12 years ago has nothing to do with what they look like now. Alex Walker has been a client of this bank for 15 years. His firm manages billions of dollars, and you just told the police he committed fraud and tore up his check in front of his mother." The word billions landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Victoria's face drained of color. "Wait," she said, quiet now, almost to herself. That's not possible." "It's not only possible," Gerald said. "It's been true for years, Victoria. You'd have known that if you'd pulled up his account instead of deciding you already knew everything you needed to know." Dean Coleman had already stepped back from Alex's side, his hand never having tightened, some instinct in him having recognized before his conscious mind caught up that whatever this was, it wasn't what Victoria had told him it was. Alex, for his part, hadn't moved much. He was watching Victoria with an expression that wasn't quite vindication and wasn't quite satisfaction. Something quieter and, in its own way, sadder than either. He'd built an entire life specifically so that moments like this one wouldn't matter to him. And in some ways, it still didn't. What mattered was the woman standing beside him, whose hand was trembling on her cane, who had just been told by her own former daughter-in-law that she was nothing more than a prop. "Mom," he said gently, turning to Margaret. "You okay?" Margaret nodded, though her eyes were wet, and she pressed a hand to her son's arm. Alex looked back at Gerald. "The check is torn," he said simply. "I assume that's fixable." "It's fixable," Gerald said immediately. "Everything about this is fixable except the part where your mother had to stand here and be spoken to like that. I can't undo that part. I'm sorry." Victoria, still holding the phone, still frozen behind the counter, finally seemed to understand the size of what she'd just done. "Gerald, I didn't know the account had grown. There's no way I could have. You could have pulled up his history," Gerald said, turning to her, his voice quiet but unyielding. "That takes less than a minute, Victoria. You could have let Rachel make the verification call she was already reaching for. Instead, you let 12 years of something personal decide how you treated a customer and his mother in front of a lobby full of witnesses. That's not a mistake. That's a choice." The lobby was dead silent, Even the phone still raised had gone still, sensing, correctly, that the story had just changed shape entirely. "End the call," Gerald said. "Tell the dispatcher it was a misunderstanding." Victoria's hands were shaking as she lifted the phone back to her ear. The police, once they arrived, because Victoria's call had already gone through before Gerald could stop it, found a scene that bore no resemblance to what had been reported. No fraud, no threats, just a shaken elderly woman leaning on her son's arm, a floor littered with torn paper, and a branch manager offering statement after statement in Alex's defense. The responding officer took one look at the situation, listened to Gerald's account, examined the paperwork Alex still had in hand, and closed the matter within minutes. There would be no charges against Alex. There would, however, be a formal record of the false report Victoria had filed, one that would follow her well beyond that afternoon. Gerald asked Alex and Margaret into his office, away from the lingering crowd in the lobby. He offered coffee, water, anything they needed. Margaret asked for tea, and Rachel, still shaken but grateful for something useful to do, brought a cup within minutes. "I need you to know this is going to be handled properly," Gerald told Alex once they were seated. "Not with an apology letter and a fruit basket." Alex studied him for a moment. "This isn't really about the check," he said. "I can afford a torn check. What I can't accept is the way she spoke to my mother. And I have a hard time believing that was the first time she's ever let something personal decide how she treats someone standing at her counter." Gerald's jaw tightened. He didn't argue. He knew, even before he pulled the records later that week, that Alex was probably right. Rachel, still hovering near the doorway, spoke up quietly. "There have been complaints," she said. "Not about this exact thing, but customers who felt like they were dismissed or judged unfairly. I don't think any of them went anywhere." Victoria handled complaints at the branch level before they went up the chain. Gerald turned to look at her, and something in his expression made it clear this was the first he was hearing of it. "Why didn't that reach me?" The silence that followed told Alex everything he needed to know about how deep this went. The internal investigation moved quickly once it started. Security footage confirmed every detail of what witnesses had already described, including the moment Victoria referenced Alex's mother directly, unprompted, in a way that had nothing to do with verifying a check and everything to do with something personal she'd been carrying for over a decade. Records showed a pattern of informal complaints at Victoria's previous branch, none of which had been escalated. Victoria herself, in her formal statement, didn't try particularly hard to deny what had happened. She'd known, the moment Gerald said the word billions, that there was no version of events where her behavior could be defended as professional judgment, rather than something far more personal. She was placed on immediate suspension, and within 2 weeks, the board's decision was final. Her banking license was permanently revoked, and she faced both a civil rights complaint tied to the incident and a separate charge related to the false police report. Employees who had helped bury the earlier complaints against her were placed under formal review as well. Word of what had happened moved through the small local banking community faster than Victoria could get ahead of it. Her second husband, Richard, from whom she'd been divorced for 2 years by then, heard about it through a mutual acquaintance and reportedly told a colleague it didn't surprise him in the slightest, a detail that made its way back to Alex eventually, though he found he took no particular satisfaction in hearing it. Victoria's personal life, in the weeks that followed, quietly came apart in the way these things sometimes do, not through any public spectacle, just the slow, accumulating weight of a community that had heard exactly what she'd said, and to whom, and had decided collectively and without much discussion, what they thought about it. Dean was reinstated once the investigation confirmed what the footage already showed, that he'd never tightened his grip on Alex, and had stepped back the instant Gerald arrived. He was placed into a newly created training program, one Alex specifically requested, teaching staff how to recognize and question an order that was clearly wrong instead of simply following it. When Alex saw him weeks later, Dean apologized quietly, admitting he wished he'd trusted his own instincts sooner. "There's nothing to apologize for," Alex told him. "I remember exactly how it felt. Your hand never tightened." Rachel was promoted, assistant branch manager, put in charge of rolling out the new training program region-wide. because she'd been the only person in that lobby willing to reach for the phone to help, and later, the only one willing to speak up about a pattern everyone else had stayed quiet about. The agreement Alex negotiated with the board reshaped the bank's policies across the region, mandatory verification procedures that couldn't be overridden by a single manager's discretion. A formal complaint escalation process, security footage retention that couldn't be quietly deleted, customer rights posted in plain language in every branch lobby. The bank issued a replacement check once the original had been formally voided. Alex split the money exactly as he'd always planned. Half covered his mother's surgery and her ongoing care, scheduled within the month, successful. And the beginning of a recovery Margaret approached with the same quiet stubbornness she'd raised her son with. The other half became the seed for the Walker-Williams Family Fund, built to give foster children the kind of stability and support that hadn't existed for his mother when she was raising him alone. He insisted the first round of grants be administered out of the Ellsworth branch itself, the same building that had once torn apart a check in front of her. 3 months later, Alex and Margaret walked back through those same glass doors. He still drove the same sedan. He still wore the same jacket. Margaret's cane tapped lightly against the marble floor, steadier now, her recovery well underway. An employee greeted them the moment they stepped inside, asking how she could help before either of them had said a word. Rachel came over in her new role, mentioning that staff training had already rolled out across the region. Dean stood near the door and offered a small, genuine nod. A plaque near the wall bore the name of the new foster fund. At one counter, a young man was opening his first account, met with none of the suspicion Alex and his mother had faced 3 months earlier. Margaret watched the scene for a long moment before turning to her son. "Is that why you didn't just close this place down?" she asked. "After everything she said to you? To us?" Alex thought about the question before answering. "Closing a door is easy," he told her. "Making it open for everyone is harder. Even for the people who never deserved to have it closed on them in the first place." Margaret nodded slowly, looking back at the young man at the counter, then up at her son again, as if measuring the distance between the fear she remembered from 3 months earlier and the calm she was watching unfold in front of her now. Before they left, Alex handed the very first grant letter to a young woman who'd grown up in the foster system, watching his mother's face as she understood, maybe for the first time in a way that would stay with her, that $5 million had never been what made her son matter. What mattered was that he'd had every reason to walk away bitter, and had chosen instead to make sure the next person through those doors would be treated like they belonged there from the start. Mother and son walked out together, continuing an afternoon that had been interrupted 3 months earlier. If you'd been standing in that lobby the day it all began, would you have stayed silent behind a raised phone? Or would you have been the one to speak up first, for a man and his mother who had done nothing wrong? A person should never need $5 million to be treated with basic respect, and the people we once loved should be the last ones to forget that, not the first. Alex Walker didn't win the day his boss recognized him as a powerful investor standing in his own branch. That moment wasn't the victory. It was just the moment the truth finally became visible to someone who'd spent 12 years refusing to imagine it. The real victory arrived later, once he took that same power and used it to make sure the next person walking through those doors, whoever they were, whatever their history, would be treated fairly from the very start. If this story moved you, subscribe for more, and carry that same lesson with you the next time you find yourself standing in a room where someone else is being underestimated.